excited to have someone who's talked here before, John Prados. He's a prolific author. But his new book is extraordinary in many ways, because Leyte Gulf is really one of the most significant battles in the history that many people outside of history buffs or naval history wonks don't know a whole lot about. And the real problem there is this is arguably the greatest naval battle in history. And I use the word arguably. Many people won't. They'll just come right out and say Leyte Gulf was the most significant and greatest naval battle in history. And while there are tens of thousands of books on World War II and thousands of books on World War II naval history and hundreds of books on World War II intelligence history, this is one of the first, if not the first, to take a deep look in using the most up-to-date historical documents on both the tactical and strategic intelligence picture of one of the most consequential battles in human history. So John Prados is a senior fellow at the National Security Archive down the street, housed at George Washington University. He focuses on national security affairs, including foreign affairs, intelligence, and military subjects. He holds a PhD in political science, international relations from Columbia, and is the author of more than 20 books in all, along with many articles and papers. His research centers on subjects including the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Vietnam War, and analysis of international relations, diplomatic and military history in a more general sense. His books include The Family Jewels, The CIA's Secrecy and Presidential Power, Safe for Democracy, The Secret Wars of the CIA, Vietnam, The History of an Unwinnable War, and William Colby and the CIA, The Secret Wars of a Controversial Spy Master. Like I said, 20 books. Pick out the ones that are really down the alley here at the Spy Museum. But among his books, Unwinnable War, Keepers of the Keys, which centers on the National Security Council, and Combined Fleet Decoded, which is on intelligence in the Pacific in World War II, were each nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. His new book, Storm Over Leyte, The Philippine Invasion and the Destruction of the Japanese Navy, has recently come out, and it's receiving rave reviews. So please join me in welcoming John Prados.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you this evening. I'm not going to speak for the entire time. I'm going to speak for part of the time and then open it up to questions. And what I would like to do is focus in sequence on a set of points, and then we can open it up for general discussion. Okay? So first, some things about Leyte Gulf which, even if you know about Leyte Gulf, you probably haven't thought about. And the first one of them is the President of the United States, okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the run-up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you know, there is this event that takes place at Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1944. Franklin Roosevelt travels to Pearl Harbor, crosses the United States in a train, gets to the Pacific Ocean, gets in a boat, sails out to Pearl Harbor, and there is a conference that takes place at Pearl in late July of 1944, where FDR brings together Douglas MacArthur from way down south and Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, right there at Pearl Harbor. And they focus on the strategy for the next round of the war. And this conference that takes place at Pearl Harbor, where it's mentioned at all in history, is usually just passed by. You know, it's like a one-sentence thing that there was this meeting at Pearl Harbor, FDR was there, you know, and FDR and MacArthur and Nimitz just talked about what was going to happen in the war. Well, actually, it's a mistake, I think, to look at that particular episode that way, because it neglects both the content of the event and also the context in which it occurred. Now, you've got to understand, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a disabled American, right? He's in a wheelchair. He doesn't want to fly in an airplane. To make this trip at all, he has to leave Washington, D.C. at the height of World War II. In fact, the day he leaves the American West Coast is the day that the German generals try to assassinate Adolf Hitler. It's a key moment in the entire passage of the war, and here is the President of the United States gone from his command post so that he can go visit Pearl Harbor, a decision that he had to make very deliberately because this trip took him away from his command post for the period of a month. Took FDR a month to travel across the United States, get in a boat, go to Pearl Harbor, have this conference, and come back. So what's important enough to take the President of the United States away from his command post for a month? So the next step in the Pacific War, the Navy and the Southwest Pacific Command, that's MacArthur's command, are both jockeying over what's the next phase of strategy. And the general aim of strategy is to win the war by isolating Japan and forcing the Japanese to surrender. And the underlying dilemma of that is whether or not you're going to be forced to mount an invasion of Japan, which, if you are, is going to entail all the difficulties of, in fact, having an invasion of Japan. So, is there a way to end the war without having to invade Japan? Now, FDR's top military advisor, a Navy admiral by the name of William Leahy, actually wanted to search for a strategy that would end the war without having to invade Japan. And he, accompanying FDR to this event, right, had that as his main interest. It's less clear what FDR's own main interest is. He left no record of this. He made no personal notes, and he didn't say anything that was recorded at the time to give us a sense of what he thought about it personally. However, FDR was a politician, and you can look at the kind of context that surrounded this situation. The Navy, Admiral Leahy, also the naval commander, Admiral King, and the Pacific Ocean commander, Admiral Nimitz, all had an interest in the next phase of strategy being an invasion of Taiwan. If you look at the position of Taiwan and the geography, and you funnel into that the average ranges, the operational ranges of Allied aircraft, and the envelopes within which they operate, a blockade of Japan mounted from Taiwan closes off the Taiwan Strait, the Luzon Strait. It actually shuts Japan away from the whole rest of Southeast Asia and the Asian mainland. That same invasion into the Philippines, if you focus your center of gravity on Luzon, around Manila and Clark Field, and you focus you funnel in the same planning factors, turns out that it doesn't block the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Asian mainland. After all, it forces you to implement a blockade by further operations. And that was a key thing, I think, in the Navy's construction of this. On the other hand, now, MacArthur is the man who was forced out of the Philippines in 1941-42, who has promised he's going to return to the Philippines. And now here is his opportunity to make that exact case to his president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the man who was the president and is a politician, and the politician who was in charge when the Philippines fell. So he has a kind of a vested interest in this. And look at what happens when he creates this meeting at Pearl Harbor and conducts the conference. He does not invite the Navy commander, Admiral Ernest J. King, the prime exponent of the Formosa invasion, the Taiwan invasion. So he is actually structuring the situation to make it easier to make a choice to land in the Philippines as opposed to going for Taiwan. Having structured that situation that way, Roosevelt got in trouble when Douglas MacArthur, who did think of this Pearl Harbor conference as a photo opportunity, refused to go. So Army Chief of Staff George Marshall had to tell MacArthur to get himself up there and go to this conference. And so they did, and as they say, the rest is history. Except that MacArthur understood what was going on. What happens in the middle of the invasion of Leyte, the first step in the Philippine campaign? MacArthur lands on the shore of the Philippines. You know, he famously says that I have returned. Later, that same day, he writes a letter. He stops. It's raining on Leyte, and the Japanese are bombarding them with artillery. MacArthur stops and sits down and writes a letter. He says, Mr. President, this is the first letter that's going to be mailed from the liberated Philippines for your philatelic collection. You know, Douglas MacArthur is interested in FDR's philatelic collection. And what does the letter say? The letter says that this invasion is going to cut off Japan from its southern resource areas. Now, it just so happens that if you were to pull out your copy of MacArthur's memoirs, which he published in 1964, you would discover that same letter reprinted in the memoir, except that MacArthur took out from his own letter the language about cutting off the Philippines from the rest of Southeast Asia. Because by 1964, MacArthur knew that the outcome of his campaign was not, in fact, to cut off Japan from the South, and he couldn't afford to have in his memoir a text that showed that he was wrong about something that he had written to the president. So that's one little item that's in this book that you can read here that you hadn't thought about the Philippine invasion before. I want to move on to some different intelligence things before we talk about a couple of other items, and then we'll throw it open. Okay, so one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt does when he visits Pearl Harbor is, of course, that he stages lots of different walk-bys and meetings with military units that are located at Pearl Harbor and in Hawaii. And two of those units are intelligence units. One, the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area, or JICPOA, and the other one being the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, or FRUPAC. Okay? Now, you understand, of course, that MacArthur's trip is top secret. You know? No one is supposed to know that MacArthur is visiting Pearl Harbor. In fact, the first that Chester Nimitz learns about this trip is when the head of FDR's presidential security detail arrives at Pacific Fleet headquarters to set up a dedicated phone line that's going to go back to Washington, D.C. for FDR to have instant communications. Before that, he doesn't even know this is happening, much less that he's about to entertain the President of the United States. Well, okay, so top secret, well, but everybody at FRUPAC and JICPOA knew to go and dress up in their best clothes. So they were all there waiting when MacArthur came by to say hello to them and wave. And We're not sure about this, but the probable reason is because there was a language officer who was with the FRUPAC guys by the name of Alvin Laswell. He was one of the key people in translating the messages that led to Yamamoto's shoot-down in the spring of 1943. Laswell used to go walking in the morning along the same route that Chester Nimitz took from his quarters up to Pacific Ocean Area headquarters. And they always walked together the last little part of that where they could exchange notes on what was going on and what was important to do that day and whatnot. So my belief is that Nimitz told Laswell during one of these walks that the president was on his way, and that news circulated as it was wont to do through the intelligence community. The thing about JICPOA and FRUPAC and the Pacific War is that these places were the location and the prime locale where information came together to identify the military maneuvers of the Japanese and the opposition. JICPOA actually was the first fusion intelligence center. It was the first center set up by United States intelligence authorities that was specifically intended to bring together the intelligence information from all sources and combine it into a form that was usable by combat commanders. And FRUPAC, of course, was kind of a forerunner of the National Security Agency, was breaking Japanese codes and producing the information that supported U.S. combat commanders. Okay? All right. So we're very familiar in general in history with the performance of these intelligence units in the early part of the Pacific War. We've heard about the shoot down of Admiral Yamamoto and the triumph at the Battle of Midway, and the role of code breaking in that battle has been told and retold many, many times. The contributions of intelligence in this later part of the war tend to be not looked at and ignored, and probably in large part because, the growth in combat potential on the Allied side and with the Americans in particular became so great that all of a sudden intelligence didn't seem to matter anymore. The Japanese lacked the combat capability to actually damage Allied forces, and the Allies had so much combat capability they could mount 1,000-plane raids from their aircraft carrier fleet. So it was a mismatch in combat capability of an enormous sort, and that kind of leads to the idea that you didn't need to pay attention to intelligence. But actually, that's not true. Actually, the contributions of JICPOA and of FRUPAC, even this late in the war, are still fundamental to the success of the Allied forces. All right? I'm going to run down a few of them. The movements of the Japanese fleet. In the summer of 1944, the Japanese mounted a large-scale operation when the Allies invaded the Mariana Islands. And that led to the biggest fleet battle before this one, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And the Japanese took major losses in this battle, and at the end of it, their fleet was wildly unbalanced, with virtually no air power in their carrier force, but a surface fleet that was largely untouched by the fighting. So they had a differently balanced force in their navy after that battle. They also had a major supply problem. The oil that was produced in Indonesia and carried by tankers to Japan, where the Japanese naval bases were located, was going begging because of their losses in fleet tankers and oilers. And one of the specific aims of our intelligence was to track Japanese tankers and oilers. And we had a program that was just about sinking Japanese tankers and oilers. So we were, in effect, directly impacting Japanese combat capabilities through intelligence. The Japanese solution to this in the summer of 1944 was to separate their carrier force, which went back to the home islands to train new pilots for the air groups, and the surface fleet, which went down to the Singapore area to be close to the oil fields where they could directly fuel their ships. So this particular disposition on the part of the Japanese fleet had everything to do with the intelligence, and it had a major determining effect on what the Japanese strategy actually would be for the next battle. Meanwhile, FRUPAC, with its daily interception of the Japanese traffic and its daily radio traffic analysis of the positions from which those messages were sent, was able to track the movements of the Japanese fleet. Now, from time to time, this led to kind of misperceptions and silliness. For example, if you look at the plots that we did of the locations of the Japanese fleet, you'll see that for a certain time in August and September of 1944, we're crediting the Japanese in the Philippines with having battleships and many heavy cruisers and stuff like this. Well, actually, it turns out that the Japanese were sending these surface ships from Japan down to the southern area, and they were using them to deliver troops. They were using them as transports and to make stops along the way, including in the Philippines, where they were carrying out a major buildup of ground forces. So for a period of time, our intelligence was actually showing a surfeit of Japanese forces in the Philippines, but for a reason that we did not understand. Or there was the time at the beginning of October, the Japanese had, sorry everybody. The Japanese had a battleship division which they had left in Japan to be part of their remaining carrier force, okay? And that battleship division, the carrier force commander, an admiral named Ozawa, said to the combined fleet commander, I can't really use these ships. They're of no use to me. I'm going to exercise a particular role in this battle. I'm going to be a decoy. These ships are better used in the combat portion of our plan, in the strike force. Send the ships down to join the battleships and cruisers that are in Southeast Asia and by Singapore. And the Japanese do that. Well, the movement of the battleship division that contains these ships down to Southeast Asia to join their main fleet at Linga is detected by the Americans of the Fleet Radio Unit. And, of course, the Americans at Jikpoa are aware that this battleship division is part of the order of battle of the Japanese mobile fleet, their carrier force. So all of a sudden, we're thinking at the beginning of October 1944 that the Japanese mobile fleet, their carriers, are deploying down into Southeast Asia. It takes a couple of days for the analysts at Pearl Harbor to realize that that was a mistake, and then they realign their thinking. So you can have these kinds of mistakes, but one of the good lessons here is precisely that good analysts with good information are able to regroup and recollect on the reporting that they're doing and change the direction and the explications that they're making to command. All right? Another issue, the Japanese Naval Air Force, the locus of Japanese combat power. Okay? JICPOA was crucial in interpreting the capabilities of the Japanese Air Force, the locations and combat strength of the Japanese Air Force, and a number of things associated with Japanese air power. In this particular period, for example, as a result of the combat in the Marianas, where we, for the first time, captured a large amount of Japanese documents all at the same time, so many documents that they were counted in tons after the campaign. Right? That was the first time that had ever happened. We got their analyses of their own Air Force, which we could translate and appreciate in our intelligence operations. We recovered information that identified particular Japanese air units and the Japanese own grading of how many of their air crews were capable of all-weather missions, how many could only fly in the daytime, how many were good enough to fly at night too. This kind of information. Now, here's an example too, of course, how in intelligence work there are disputes. Over the Japanese air order battle, there was a primary dispute during this period of time about the overall size of the Japanese air fleet. Okay? Our intelligence experts in Washington with the high command carried certain numbers for the Japanese that differed from the numbers that JICPOA had at Pearl Harbor. The two sides discussed what their differences were and how to reconcile them. And it worked out that at Pearl Harbor, the JICPOA analysts were expecting that Japanese aircraft that were assigned to training air groups might fight if they were thrust into a combat situation, whereas the intelligence people in Washington were thinking that, that training air groups were no part of the order of battle. So they went back and forth over this. They decided that they would take the Washington numbers and put Pearl Harbor out of the business of estimating the Japanese Naval Air Force order of battle, and that's what they did. A couple months later, Admiral Halsey's fleet attacks Formosa, Taiwan, and has a major air battle with the Japanese Naval Air Force, and the Japanese combat training organizations participate in defending Taiwan because they were located there, so they were going to fight. So that was a place where intelligence perhaps could have been better. Okay? I mentioned tankers. The American Radio Intelligence Network was following Japanese tankers very carefully. By the fall of 1944, we actually considered the Japanese tanker movements to be an indicator for their fleet operations. So if you look at the intelligence reporting in the last weeks before the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you will see reports of Japanese orders to tanker units to move to various harbors and various islands, and then notations to the effect that, oh, well, we think this indicates that a fleet movement is in process in that direction. Okay. One of the big things that is talked about in Leyte and accounts of this battle is the sort of semi-famous Z plan. This was the combined fleet's general strategic plan for the conduct of a decisive battle against the Americans. And if you're familiar with this history, there is it's a throwback to the Japanese Fleet Command in the time before the Marianas Battle, where the Japanese Fleet Commander organizes this plan and plots a major sort of architecture for a naval battle. And he embodies this plan in a document that is bound in red and on the cover bears the letter Z. So the Japanese called it the Z plan. Z being a throwback actually to the Russo-Japanese War, where the Japanese fleet commander of that era, Admiral Togo, had used the Z flag to enthuse his sailors at the big battle, and to Pearl Harbor for that matter, where the Japanese fleet commander at the time, Nagumo, had flown the same Z flag to enthuse his sailors at the very dawn of the Pacific War. Here, the fleet commander is assembling a Z plan in hopes of getting back at the Americans. Okay? This Z plan becomes a casualty of war. In the period just before the Marianas Battle, the Americans under Raymond Spruance, actually at that time, Spruance and Halsey traded places as the commanders of the American carrier fleet. Anyway, that commander was faced with a carrier raid by Spruance's carriers in his base. He, not wanting to suffer the fate of Admiral Yamamoto, decided he would get out of town. So he and the combined fleet staff loaded up on airplanes and flew away. This was at Palau, where they were at that time, and which we raided at the end of March 1944. They flew away, but they encountered a storm front trying to get to the Philippines, and both of the planes on which the combined fleet staff flew were lost. One of them, however, crashed right close to Cebu Island of the Philippines, and this document, the Z plan, survived the crash. It was in a briefcase that was recovered by fishermen who rescued some of the Japanese officers who were able to escape from this airplane, including the combined fleet chief of staff. The Americans were able to spirit this document, this briefcase. They were able to spirit the briefcase to Australia, where MacArthur's intelligence people made copies of the documents before returning them so that the Japanese wouldn't realize this material had been compromised. And we were then able to translate and appreciate the Japanese fleet plan. And this Z plan contained elements that were part of the strategy that the Japanese would in fact use at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and therefore it was of use to Allied commanders who were in the heat of that action. So the Z plan was another contribution of intelligence to this situation. Okay? Now, I mentioned that there was an air battle for Taiwan. All right? And this actually is of vital importance for the outcome of the battle itself because it represents a major Japanese strategic miscalculation, i.e., they commit the Air Force too soon and separately from their surface forces. But it's also a starring moment for American intelligence because FRUPAC is able to intercept and break the code on all of the different messages by which the Japanese order in reinforcement aircraft to Taiwan to become the basis for the big attack that they're going to make against the U.S. fleet. So American intelligence is following the Japanese reinforcement track almost in real time during the period of the Battle of Formosa. Okay? Now, sometimes radio traffic analysis can also make you wrong. What happens at Leyte Gulf is that the big Japanese surface fleet, the one that's located down near Singapore, the one that's commanded by Admiral Kurita, that's going to be the basis of their big strike. And our intelligence guys, of course, are watching it. Now, in these days that are before satellite photography and before overhead interception, interception is more tricky, and the overhead imagery isn't there at all. So it's easier to get fooled. The Japanese radios that are part of the Kurita fleet aren't moving when our traffic analysts plot their messages. So we're telling our combat commanders that the Japanese fleet is not reacting, even though the Kurita fleet is starting to move toward the Philippines. Now, again, this is a mistake that goes away quickly because very soon it becomes apparent that the transmission posts are, in fact, in movement. And so we are able to correct that. Okay? Now, that leads to the very basic question, the first most important question about the Japanese surface fleet. Is it going to come fight? Is the Japanese Navy going to respond to an Allied invasion of the Philippines? So the question of the intelligence appreciations of whether the Japanese are going to fight, that belongs at the heart of any discussion of all of this. All right? And here's the situation. I mentioned there was this Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese took huge losses. And after it, they split the fleet in the way that I described, and they had and faced the prospect of having to reconstitute their air arm and their air forces to have really any combat power at all. So our analysts, after the Philippine Sea battle, the ones at Jikpoa and the ones in Washington, agreed that there wasn't any near-term prospect of a Japanese intervention with their fleet. When we thought about what the Japanese situation was, we thought it will be probably around December 1944, by the time the Japanese can reconstitute their carrier air groups. And so this is the beginning of the time frame in which we may expect to see them again. So that was the position that was taken at Jikpoa in Pearl Harbor, also in Washington. The British, who had an Allied intelligence service and they had their own Far East intelligence bureau, agreed with that analysis. MacArthur's command agreed right after the Philippine Sea battle, but as time progressed, they changed their opinion. And in late September of 1944, they began to argue that yes, indeed, the Japanese fleet will come out and will contest invasion of the Philippines. And it turns out that MacArthur's intelligence people, the 7th Fleet Intelligence Center, they were correct in that appreciation. All right? The Japanese fleet that conducted the Leyte battle organized itself in a certain particular fashion. They gave their combat forces new tactical titles, calling one the 1st Diversion Attack Force and another one the 2nd Diversion Attack Force. All right? These were their principal surface elements. U.S. intelligence identified both of those tactical titles and associated them with the Japanese forces well ahead of the combat situation. All right? The Japanese plan involved this idea of a decoy, which I mentioned briefly. Let me talk about that a little bit more. they were going to use those aircraft carriers, which they knew that we thought were so dangerous, as a dangle to get us to not pay attention to those guys over there, the surface fleet. And that's what they did. Well, we captured from the Japanese, also in the Marianas, a Japanese manual, something that was called striking force tactics. In the Japanese fleet, the aircraft carrier force was known as the striking force, the Kido Butai. And in the Japanese manual that we captured, this spoke of a fresh idea that became part of this Z plan, which was that a weak carrier force could be used as a dangle. Our intelligence people at JICPOA, we had a regular series of pamphlets that we published that was called Knowing Your Enemy. And it embodied various different things. It was general intelligence about Japanese naval construction, about tactics, about organization of air bases, whatever, what have you. We published in Knowing Your Enemy excerpts from this Japanese fleet manual about using naval forces as dangles. All right? So all of these things are examples of how intelligence helped, hindered, but definitely affected what went down at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, I can go on and give you a whole rap about the battle itself and what happened and whatnot, but maybe this is a good time to stop and take your questions, and we can deal with that in that fashion.
Hold on, please. Sorry.
Oh, we've got a mic here. Okay, excellent.
You mentioned that when they had the briefcase with the Z plan, that they copied it and then wanted to give it back to the Japanese. How did they do that so that they didn't notice it was missing?
Yes, well, the Japanese chief of staff of the combined fleet knew that he had escaped from the airplane with this briefcase. And he was rescued by these Philippine fishermen who were in touch with the partisan resistance. So he became a prisoner of war. And he was intensely worried about those documents. Okay? But he was a prisoner. So he was powerless at first to do anything about them. The Allies immediately, or MacArthur's command immediately decided that they would do something about this. And at first they wanted to actually bring all of these prisoners taken to Australia, but then Japanese occupation troops in Cebu and Negros, the surrounding islands, began to put out patrols and look for these survivors, and it was soon a struggle between the partisans and Japanese ground forces about what was going to be done with these prisoners and what was going to happen. And meanwhile, MacArthur's command had sent a submarine up. At first it was going to take back the prisoners, but eventually they decided that they would just take the briefcase and the documents, and that's what they did. The submarine was named the Creval, and it took the documents to Brisbane, and our intel people there took care of them. But meanwhile, the partisans, under pressure from Japanese ground troops, exchanged back the prisoners. Now, once the Japanese admiral, who had been the chief of staff, was back in Japanese hands, the Japanese ground command learned that this briefcase was missing. All right? But that meant that there was an interval of time in which the Japanese high command was not aware that the documents were missing. And even when they found out about it, they could not know that the documents had been put on an American submarine and taken away. So we flew the documents back to the Philippines on a PBY, gave them back to the partisans, and the partisans made a show of giving them back to the Japanese. The Japanese held a court of inquiry for this admiral and about these documents, and they decided that they had not been compromised. That was a Japanese mistake.
Wait, sorry.
You mentioned early on that the a conference out in Pearl Harbor that Roosevelt went to was partly at least about the avoidance of the invasion of Japan. Wasn't the Manhattan Project the main way of avoiding the invasion of Japan?
Well, this is one of the central themes that I have in this book is there a way to avoid the use of the atomic bomb? I'm sure that was Leahy's angle on this. Admiral Leahy's angle was to avoid the dilemmas of invading Japan. If you can get the Japanese to surrender, that obviates the need to use atomic bombs to invade Japan. That aside, except for Franklin Roosevelt, right? No one at that conference in the fall of 1944, perhaps Leahy, maybe Leahy knew, but nobody knew about the atomic bomb except them.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I know very, very little about the Pacific War, so what I'm about to ask may turn out to be a really stupid or naive question, so I apologize in advance. So you've talked about a lot of really interesting sort of analytic stories here. And I guess the question I have is, MacArthur strikes me as the kind of guy who, he thought well of himself, and might be the kind of guy to sort of exert command influence over what he thought the intelligence assessment should be, politicization in our terms. I'm curious if any of that happened with him, and I guess more generally, are there instances here where any of these commanders that you've been talking about sort of dictated what the answer was supposed to be by God?
Absolutely. And actually, that reminds me of something that I should have mentioned, but I'll get back to that. MacArthur definitely had an interest in his intelligence, and he had his top intelligence officer, a general named Willoughby, who was even more intensely interested, shall we say, in politicization than he. All right? And this comes up specifically with regard to the question of, is the Japanese fleet going to intervene when we invade the Philippines? Willoughby wanted to avoid a judgment that the Japanese would move. He wanted to minimize that judgment. And that position is actually reflected by MacArthur's air commander, General George Kenney, who issues a report just a few days before the Leyte invasion, in fact, that says that we have no expectation that the Japanese are going to intervene. And meanwhile, at the level of the 7th Fleet Intelligence Center, the discussion goes back and forth about whether the Japanese are going to intervene. And at the level of the 7th Fleet Operations Center, there's also a parallel discussion in progress. There was a senior operations planner, a captain by the name of Tarbuck, who wrote the key memo on this subject as they moved from September into October, and his conclusions that he felt the Japanese would intervene came to be the predominant position of the MacArthur's intelligence apparatus, even though Willoughby and Kenney both disagreed. There is disputed evidence on whether the 7th Fleet Intelligence Center's products reflected this sense that the Japanese would intervene. And I don't want to get too technical here, but the guy who was in charge, a Navy captain, his position was that the first document, the one that said the Japanese would not intervene until they retrained the carrier air groups, was a written document that was circulated to subordinate commands, and the judgments that changed that original judgment in MacArthur's command area, those things were circulated by radio message. So they had a different status within the communication system. So they dispute whether or not these were real judgments or not. But there is a real question there.
I have it in my head that this is a unique battle because it's the first in which the two fleets never established eye contact with each other. And am I wrong on that?
One of the things that is super duper about this battle actually is that it's really one of the only naval battles in history where surface forces actually were in complete contact with aircraft carriers and they were shelling them. So you may be thinking about the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is the first one in which the fleets were never in eye contact. But it's very special about this battle, in fact, precisely that an aircraft carrier force was caught by a surface fleet. And that is actually the locus of one of the biggest controversies about this battle is what happens with the American carriers that are trapped by the Japanese and how it is that they manage to escape from the Japanese super battleships and all this kind of a thing. And by the way, here's the intelligence thing that I neglected to mention. You know, all of this stuff about code breaking was so secret, was so super secret. You know, we went to enormous lengths and stood on our heads to avoid ever revealing that the secret of the code breaking. And in fact, it wasn't until the German Enigma code breaking was revealed in the middle 1970s that anybody really sort of came out to talk about this, okay? During the war, the actual circulation of the messages based on code breaking was very tightly controlled and only through very narrow channels and only to specifically engaged people. Well, in the case of this Japanese fleet that emerges from the Philippines and catches the American aircraft carriers and is in the middle of shelling them and chasing them and about to run them down, back there at Pearl Harbor, right, Chester Nimitz gets radio intercepts and traffic analysis that shows the Japanese surface fleet is located on the Pacific side of the Philippine Islands. In other words, it's clear to him at Pearl Harbor that the Japanese had broken through the Philippines and were about to jump on the American fleet down there near Leyte. What does Chester Nimitz do? And this is not the thing about where is Task Force 34. This is right on the code breaking, right? Nimitz sends two, not one, but two messages to the tactical commanders and gives them geographic locations in longitude and latitude for the Japanese fleet and says in the message, this is ultra. In other words, here in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in the middle of the combat action, we broke all the rules about the secrecy of communications intelligence in World War II because the Japanese were breaking out and going after us in the battle.
So let's talk about that particular event specifically. You have the escort carriers and the destroyer escorts trying to fight off, ships that were bigger than they were all combined. And I think it was Admiral Kurita, was it?
Yes, Kurita.
Admiral Kurita was supposed to do a suicide mission and destroy that force, and yet he turns around and he had him dead to rights. Did you find out any reason why Admiral Kurita made that spectacularly weird decision, even though he knew he was going in for his final mission?
This is definitely one of the key controversies, if that's the right word, about this battle. And it's wrapped up in the whole situation of the combat action and of choices that were made on the Japanese side in terms of command relationships, in my opinion. All right? Now, let me preface this next piece by saying Kurita, after this, was not employed again in an operational capacity by the Japanese Navy, okay? They sent him off to be the superintendent of the Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, okay? And he had multiple opportunities for the rest of his life to like speculate, like give reasons, all of this kind of a thing, right? And the reasons that he gives or gave were sort of instrumental ones, you know. I was tired, I'd been on my feet 72 hours, you know, this kind of a thing, right? But if you look at the evolution of the combat action in the battle, I think you can start to see a kind of a way that it ends up the way it did, the way it does. Okay, first of all, you know, St. Lo and all those other ships, you know, they're escort carriers, right? You couldn't go more than 20 knots if you fueled them with nitroglycerin, you know? But Kurita didn't know that. Kurita thought that he was engaged against a fleet, a task force, a fleet carrier force capable of 33 knots with fast battleships and all the rest. The Japanese skills at ship identification had eroded so badly by 1944 that they were looking at destroyer escorts as destroyers and destroyers as cruisers, you know, and battleships too, right? So they were mistaken about what they were facing. That's number one. One of the things that's often said about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and if you've read books about this, you're familiar with this criticism, is that Kurita made a big mistake by not making his cruisers form up on the battleships and forming a single line ahead battle fleet, right? Well, you know, the Japanese battleships in the Kurita fleet, one of them had been damaged by bombs and was down to 25 knots. Another one had a bad screw left over from the Midway battle, never corrected. It was limited to 21. His big ship, the Yamato, was rated at 28 knots, tops, 26 battle speed. Against a 33-knot fleet carrier, you know, there wouldn't have been a battle. Kurita's cruisers were rated at 34 and 35 knots. Samuel Eliot Morrison and others all criticized Kurita for not forming up on the battleships, but by telling his fleet to execute a general chase, he was taking advantage of the superior speed of his cruisers versus a fleet carrier force, and even more so, his cruisers against these escort carriers that are so slow. So that becomes item number one, okay? Item number two is that the commander of the Japanese battleships under Kurita, an admiral by the name of Ugaki, was incensed that Kurita was on his ship because that kept him from commanding them, right? So he threw a fit on the bridge of the Yamato in the middle of this battle, and Kurita stepped back and let him take over. All right? So that was a key mistake, and that probably is related to Kurita's state of exhaustion and his mental state at that moment in this battle. But the consequence of it was this. The Americans, they're desperate to protect the slow-running, you know, escort carriers, so they send the destroyers and the destroyer escorts to make a desperate torpedo attack. So the Americans come through the smoke screens. They're being shelled by the Japanese, incredible amounts of firepower against them, and they loose their torpedoes aimed at the Japanese battleships. So here's torpedoes coming to the Japanese battleships, and here's Ugaki, who took control. Now, Ugaki has not commanded a warship since 1938, and he spent most of the war up until shortly before 1944 as Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto at the Combined Fleet. So his expertise is not in ship driving. The guy who is the captain of the Yamato was an expert ship driver, and so was Kurita, but not Ugaki. The Japanese, facing the torpedoes coming against them, had two choices, right? They could turn into them to thread the torpedoes, or they could turn away. Okay? And this was not just a choice that was faced by the battleship Yamato, right? The battleship Haruna had to make the same choice, and two Japanese cruisers had to make that choice. And every one of those captains chose to turn into the torpedoes, but the Yamato turns away. And the consequence of turning away in this particular situation is that there are torpedoes that are running up both sides of the ship, which the Yamato is not fast enough to run away from. So it must maintain that course specifically until the torpedoes run down and fail. And that takes the Yamato out of position, by a factor of many miles, and loses contact with the whole battle that's going on with the American aircraft carriers. Imagine this situation, right? I mean, at 8:10 a.m. off the island of Samar, with, by the way, the American aircraft carriers, what is their defense against the Japanese fleet? It's to send up all their airplanes and have them attack with anything and everything that they can put together, right? So there are all these mosquitoes and gnats that are flying around all over the place, making passes at the Japanese fleet, trying to ward off that threat against the American task force, TAFI actually. It's just this little task group of escort carriers, right? That means that the sky is totally dominated by these Americans. What does the Yamato do at 8:10 in the morning on that day of battle? It launches a float plane. Why do you launch a float plane in the middle of an American-dominated sky? Only because you don't know what the hell is going on. And that was Kurita's situation at 8:10 a.m. So he turns the ship back toward the battle, and they try and catch up, but they're coming from behind all the way, and then there's this semi-famous episode on the Japanese side of the battle where there's this supposed sighting of another American carrier force, and one that is close to the San Bernardino Strait, which is where the Kurita fleet came through in the first place. So Kurita makes the decision to reform his fleet so that he can regain control of it, and do so in the direction of this other sighting, that maybe they can track down those other Americans over there, right? And that is the next moment in all of this, right, where they do in fact lose contact with the TAFI, and the American escort carriers get away. Now, pretty quickly, Kurita realizes that this is not such a hot idea, and it's not, in fact, as you said, what he was ordered to do. So they come around and they head for Leyte Gulf again, and then there's another wild goose chase, and finally they give it up and they head for home. In the meantime, they've lost ships here and ships there and ships in the other place, and the strength of the fleet is heavily, heavily attrited, and soon they're fleeing for their lives. I think that the Japanese admiral was in over his head and fell victim to his own weakness in giving Ugaki the helm on the Yamato.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. John Prados for taking the time to talk to us here tonight. Thank you so much. And again, thank the naval intelligence professionals. I'm a little more awake now than I was before. It's been a long day. For co-sponsoring this with us. And we hope that you take a chance to look at some of the programs that we have coming up. The fall is a great time for the Spy Museum and program. So we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.